it's worth us contextualizing why long and high effort study builds are bad for the industry. This Tufts data is probably familiar to many of you who read industry journals or who have heard Ken Get speak. On the left-hand chart, the fact that R&D spending has quadrupled over the last 20 years is definitely not resulted in the same level of output or value generated. And on the right-hand side, the cost of actually developing a single drug and bringing it to market has more than doubled. So for all those dollars spent in R&D, you're going to have to spend twice as much as you would have done 15 years ago just to get the same output. Now, much of this cost is attributable to the failures of many of the other drugs in development that did not make it through, but equally importantly, it's because of the direct costs and time-based costs that have increased dramatically as well. And this is where technology should have had a bigger impact in actually reversing these costs. So if we go to the next slide. And this table really emphasizes the challenges we face and why we need more modern technologies to improve our productivity and success rates. If we look at the complexity of studies across a number of different variables, it's clear study design and conduct is getting a lot more challenging. But as complexity increases, therefore so does the EDC design and build to support the study. So looking at some of these parameters, some of these variables, between the years of 2001 and 2015, the number of endpoints has increased by over 80%. The number of procedures being performed has increased by nearly 2/3. We're now collecting nearly 1/3 of our data that actually isn't necessary to prove our endpoints, isn't needed for the study. So 80% increase in non-core data, which is really exacerbating the amount of data we're collecting, which is near to 1 million data points in an average large phase 3 study. So again, an increase of nearly 90% over the course of 15 years. And because technology is not serving the purpose always that it's required to, it's not fitting the needs of different study designs, the number of data collection applications being used has grown from 2 to 6 on average across survey respondents from Tufts over this time frame as well. So a huge increase in the amount of data collection applications being used. So complexity has increased exponentially, but technology has not evolved with it. So really that's like asking you to do your job today on Windows 98, something similar from that time frame. Now if we go to the next slide, nothing emphasizes this more than the data from Tufts on EDC study builds. Technology should be driving productivity improvements, but it's actually taking longer today to build a study than it was 15 years ago. Veeva sponsored Tufts in the last couple of years to perform a survey of the e-clinical landscape, and our survey respondents on average said that it takes 10 weeks to build and deploy an EDC database. There are other sources out there that say it's 14 to 19 weeks to deploy a study depending on the complexity. So whether it's 10 weeks, 14 weeks, 19 weeks, either way, that's far too long. Now, obviously, there's going to be pockets of innovation in certain organizations. Larger companies running tens of studies a year will have optimized some of their processes, so they may be faster than this. So I treat this as good directional data. But if we think that 50% of industry-sponsored clinical trials are coming from emerging biopharma, so they're being conducted by companies that just run 1 or 2 studies a year, they're not going to have the opportunity to continuously improve. So this time frame probably is accurate for the industry as a whole. Now if we go to the next slide, within that context, thinking about now the broader industry picture, what are the current processes to design and build a study, and what can we change? How can we drive improvement? So if we go to the next slide, as long as I remember, and since I started as an EDC project manager over 15 years ago, the process for ECRF design has been very well established and has remained the same. It's still exactly the same process today as it was 15 plus years ago to design and build a study in EDC. And it's the tried and tested waterfall approach where each step in the process has to occur and complete sequentially before the next step can start. So I won't walk you through each one on the slide, as many of you will have lived this and know it all too well. Typically, this is a process that can take 2 to 4 weeks alone. Now, if we go to the next slide, actually, we need to squash those steps up to make more room on the screen, because if we want to represent the entire design process, so not only the ECRF design, but also the edit check design, we need to add another 5 or so steps to account for that edit check design process. So now we're in the region of 4 to 6 weeks for a lot of organizations, particularly those that do just run a handful of studies a year. And overall, that's about 12 to 15 steps that have to run sequentially. One cannot start before the other stops. And at the end of all this is actually when database development can actually start. So we're only about halfway through the full end-to-end process. It's this lack of efficiency in the process caused by technology that really is what's creating so many challenges for us, and ensuring that people have to follow this waterfall step. If we go to the next slide. Thinking about that design process that took 4 to 6 weeks, we now believe that actually you should be able to design, build, test, and deploy your study in the same 4 to 6 week time frame. So actually go through the entire process, no matter what the study, the complexity of its design, or whether you're starting from scratch or you're starting from an established standards library. We believe you should be able to build your entire study, test it, and deploy it within 4 to 6 weeks. Now, if we go to the next slide, our belief is that this is really centered around 6 key principles of Agile design to enable this. And this is where really you should look at your technology vendor to ensure that they are following an optimal process, and they're enabling you to build and develop your study in the least amount of time and effort. If we look at number 1, design, that should be so simple that you can work directly in the system to create forms, rules, edit checks, that you don't have to specify them first. And that the specification is actually an output of the work that you do in the system. So immediately we're cutting out some of those waterfall steps that we just looked at. Numbers 2 and 3, it should be simple and low effort to support any design complexity, particularly when there are visits or forms being dynamically generated. This should not require extensive programming, and you should have a rule engine that allows few and simple rules and logic to drive multiple scenarios. Number 4, again, thinking about that waterfall approach, we should be able to rip that up and make live changes or fixes to the system while actual testing is ongoing. Not have users log all of their findings, share them, the database developer reviews them, they agree the changes and the timelines, the changes are made, and then they retest. Instead, do all of that in the moment, make those changes live, and shave days from your user acceptance testing. Of course, once the study's live, we can anticipate multiple study amendments. Other Tufts research showed that on average, 2.3 protocol amendments per study. So again, technology should allow you to make changes quickly and easily with no downtime or migrations. There should be no barriers to making changes. Then finally, going full around to number 6, a good standards library that allows for reuse and limits the amount of new design and build necessary is critical. So for any new study, the library and your functionality should highlight what in the design and build is net new and has not already been validated and therefore needs to be tested, whereas what has actually already been validated and does not require retesting. Again, this can be a huge time saving by having difference reports to show you what is new in your study build. So if we go to the next slide. So it's really through applying these principles that Vertex have been able to halve their database build and deployment times using modern cloud.